Welcome to the Forging Honor podcast. I'm Jonathan George.
And I'm Benjamin Jones. Here at Forging Honor, we explore what it means to live as Christian men. Along the way, we'll be doing challenges, building habits and character through action.
In today's episode, Banjo and I get to interview Dr. George Grant. We discuss learning and the life of learning and how we can pursue it. We focus in on curiosity, planning for learning, some aspects of learning including notes, highlighting, etc. And we also discuss some different styles of learning, especially between Islam and Christianity. We hope you enjoy the episode. All right. It is challenge check-in time. As a reminder, challenges last for 6 weeks. That is a total of 42 days. They are simple daily tasks to grow us as Christian men. The current challenge is pretty simple. Read or write something for at least 15 minutes every day. The goal of this is to foster the habit of a life of learning. Banjo, how's it going for you?
So far, so good. Not perfect this week. Had a really busy schedule and also just kind of missed some days this week. So I think it was a 5 out of 7. Focusing lately more, I think, on the writing side of things and the reading, which has been good. I'm trying to get better at editing as a process as well. So I've been counting that as part of the writing time, just trying to get better at rethinking some of the language that I choose and trying to hone in and working on that craftsmanship. So that's been good. Had some rewarding reading today, and then I started teaching again today as well. So I feel like it's fun to get back on the other side of that court a little bit, and trying to work that muscle again, so I can get back in the earn the whiteboard and earn the marker, and that sort of thing. But how about you, JJ? How's it going for you this week?
Similar to you, only got 5 out of 7. But I will say I've slowed down a little bit. The first couple of weeks, I was really getting back into it because I started out easy, picking up some fiction, and I finished off a lot of the fiction that I had picked up. So now I'm telling myself, well, I should try some other things. So I picked up an autobiography, and that's been a little slower going. It's Theodore Roosevelt's. So that's been cool. Fun, but it's slower going than a fiction book that just keeps you interested in the plot. At any rate, it's been a good challenge so far. I'm looking forward to it more. But we have a guest today, a guest that I'm excited to have on, someone I've known for a while. Dr. George Grant is the pastor emeritus of Parish Presbyterian Church and the founder of Franklin Classical School, the Comenius School, Bannockburn College, and New College Franklin. He's the director of King's Meadow Study Center and the coordinator of the Chalmers Fund. He's the author of dozens of books in the areas of history, biography, politics, literature, and social criticism, and he has written hundreds of essays, articles, and columns. He has pioneered efforts to establish classical Christian schools in the U.S. and around the world, particularly in the Muslim world, with several large and thriving schools in Iraq and Indonesia. His church history podcast, Resistance and Reformation, is available on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. His linguistic and etymology podcast, Wordplay, is heard on World Radio's The World and Everything in It. He makes his home in Middle Tennessee, near the historic town of Franklin, with his wife and co-author, Karen. Together, they have 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren. His books, podcasts, a variety of curriculum packages, and a host of other resources are available at his website, www.georgegrant.net. Dr. Grant, welcome to the show. We are excited to have you.
Well, I am excited to finally be on. As a longtime listener, it's a delight. I'm so excited for what you guys are doing.
It's an exciting thing. And I'm excited to have on a guest who has listened to the show. So that's cool.
We don't normally have that.
Well, excellent stuff. We're excited to have you on today just to talk about education. But before we get into specific questions, give us we've already read off an incredible bio, and there's plenty more that we had to cut. But give us a brief overview of how you got into education, what you're passionate about in the world of education, and then how you have fostered this as you've gotten older.
Well, I was not given a great education as a kid. I actually went to public schools and then went on to the university, to a public university. And I thought that I was a pretty good student because I made good grades. So after I started having children with my wife, Karen, I was peculiarly thrown into a situation where I started working for politicians, writing white papers and, in some cases, ghostwriting campaign books. And in the process, I started really researching our founding fathers. And what I saw astonished me and caused me to realize that I really did not know anything about the life of the mind, the riches of Western civilization, the great literary traditions. I'd made great grades through college. I even had gone on and gotten a master's degree. I'd gone to seminary, but I didn't know anything. That began a process of passionate, lifelong learning. And I say lifelong, it really began when I was in my 20s, but it has continued ever since over the course of the last half century. And I am continually astonished by how much there is yet to learn. And so I've become a passionate reader, and I'm really curious about a whole lot of different things. And that has served me well because I've been able to do a lot of different things. And so the process of learning became a pathway to teaching, but really it's a benefit in and of itself. It's not necessary to be a teacher or to have a teaching profession in order to launch into lifetime learning and the disciplines of the mind.
That's excellent. You mentioned the early opportunities working with some politicians, and how that helped motivate you to learn more because you were learning about our nation's history. However, knowing some other politicians that currently exist and the political spectrum as it is, my question is, what made you care about that? Because it seems to me that a lot of folks see that and then go, and move on, thinking they're going to go do the next best thing. So was there anything in particular that helped motivate you to actually start caring about this stuff and delving into that life of learning?
Well, part of it was that as I began to research founding fathers and a lot of the heroes that even came before the founding fathers, one of the things that I started with was I started reading the founding fathers. And then I realized, I don't need to be reading the founding fathers. I need to be reading what the founding fathers read. So I started down that path, partly because what I saw in Washington were a lot of empty politicians, a lot of people that contrasted very badly with our founding fathers. They had great hair and great teeth, and they were quite telegenic and gifted in a way in communication or whatever political strategy, but they didn't have depth. And I wanted to explore what made that depth so prevalent in early America, and was there a way for us to start to recover some of that riches, some of that depth, some of that breadth? So that's kind of what sent me on the journey.
That's really cool to hear some of those pieces coming together. Just before we get too far along, I just wanted to say, Dr. Grant, that I didn't realize this until I started talking with JJ before we began recording. But I've read one of your books, Carry a Big Stick, The Uncommon Heroism of Theodore Roosevelt. I read that at a young age, and it was an important book for me, actually, in my growing up, because Teddy Roosevelt became a really big figure for me, and kind of my understanding of myself and something to reach for. I'm curious, as you're talking about these founding fathers and these heroes of America. Was there any element of Teddy Roosevelt that was particularly compelling, or maybe any of the books that you found on his shelf that you were like, I've got to go pick this up. I got to read this one?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt was one of those really remarkable figures. He wrote about 60 books. He read 5 books every single week of his life. And that's side by side with being exceedingly busy with a large family. He had a lifelong romance with his wife. He had this gaggle of 6 children. He was incredibly proficient in a whole host of different areas. Not only did he make his living as a journalist, but he was also a professional taxidermist. He loved hunting and fishing, and he was a Golden Gloves boxer. He was a rancher on the Dakota Territory. He was just one of those Renaissance men. So were there books of on Teddy Roosevelt's shelf that I wanted to read? Yes, I followed sort of the rabbit trail any number of times. And currently, right now, I'm actually fascinated with the children of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's oldest son, Ted Jr., was the governor of the Philippines and the governor of Puerto Rico. He was the only soldier, as a brigadier general, the only soldier in World War II who went ashore on all 5 of the major invasions of the Allied forces. He was a part of the amphibious assault in North Africa, to Sicily, to Italy, to Corsica, Sardinia. And at the age of 57, he was one of the first men ashore in the invasion of Normandy on D-Day.
Wow.
And he was just one of those most remarkable men. I'm reading one of his books right now called All in the Family, where he tells the family story. But his younger brother, Archie, was one of the founders of the CIA and one of the fathers of the modern conservative movement. It's just this really remarkable family. And so I continue to be fascinated. I wrote the Teddy Roosevelt book some 30 years ago, and I'm still exploring aspects of his life and his family.
That's just an incredible, an incredibly family tree there. It raises the question in my mind as we're talking about those things. As somebody looking at a family like that, I would be tempted to say, wow, that's just nurture. Or just nature. That's just the stock that they're coming from. But I'm sure education, nurture must have played some role in this. I think we get trapped in these boxes of like, well, I'm a smart person, or I'm not a book person, or I'm not a math person. How do people like the Roosevelts, and how can we keep a mind open and kind of flexible to learning new things? How do we keep pushing ourselves into things that are maybe uncomfortable in that way?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is curiosity. Obviously, it was an extraordinary family that they had lots of advantages. Growing up as a kid with Teddy Roosevelt as a father was, in and of itself, incredibly inspiring. And so that was an advantage. But they worked hard. They read. They were accomplished. Ted Jr. became the president of American Express. He was the first American into battle as a part of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Was badly wounded, walked with a limp for the rest of his life. In fact, when he was 57 years old and went ashore on Utah Beach in Normandy, he did so with a cane. He walked with a cane. So they worked hard. They were disciplined, and they had great curiosity. And I think that's one of those things that we have to develop and nurture, and we feed it. All too often, we feed ourselves the junk food of the mind from social media and video games and all of the rest, television, streaming, all of that kind of stuff. But these were people who wrestled with books, ideas. Teddy Roosevelt spoke 5 languages fluently. He did scientific expeditions on 3 continents. I mean, it was a lot of hard work, but in the end, that hard work, it pays off and pays extraordinary dividends.
How do you do the hard work of feeding yourself discipline?
Well, first of all, you are intentional. You have to plan it, and you have to make sure that you don't let anything interfere with it. I know as a young dad, time is really, really precious. So what I did was I would just get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to make sure that I got time in the Word of God and time to begin to explore whatever it was that I was studying at the time. This fall I'm going to Italy, and I've got several days in Florence, and it's not a pleasure trip; it's a work trip. But in order to prepare for it, I started back in June reading everything I could about Brunelleschi and his dome, about the Medicis, about the book trade, the development of all of that. I'm in the middle of Walter Isaacson's huge biography of Leonardo da Vinci, just to get myself ready so that when I'm there, I'm able to see with clarity and understand what I'm seeing and have a deeper and a more profound appreciation for it.
So there's our next challenge, Banjo. Get up at 4 a.m. every day.
Wait, that's just an hour. That's just an hour earlier than what I'm doing now for school. So bring it on.
So close yet so far.
I know.
When you're approaching one of these subjects, because looking at your bibliography, there are dozens of different subjects that you've been interested in. How do you even start learning about something? Is it just pick up and read whatever, or is there some kind of research process and planning process you go through?
Yeah, there is a process, and the process is necessarily different for different kinds of projects. But it always starts with reading. It always starts with gathering a few tools, following the footnote trail, and letting my curiosity take me. On Thursday, for instance, I'm lecturing on the second 100 Years' War. The first 100 Years' War was primarily in the 14th century between France and England. The second 100 Years' War spans the 18th and 19th centuries, and is not often considered a single war because it includes the French Revolution and the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. But one of the things that it has done is it's caused me to look at Franco-Anglo relations through the years, and it's led me to explore all kinds of things: the approach to revolution, the collapse of the divine right of kings, all of that kind of stuff. So you kind of follow the line of curiosity and start making connections between things so that you can see the larger patterns and then come up with the really cool stories that make those larger patterns come alive.
How do you keep track of all of that? Because that's a lot of information you're bringing in. Do you have some crazy complicated note system, or is there some simpler method?
Yeah, it's a lot simpler. I have kept journals for years. I have a stack of notebooks, and I really believe that Umberto Eco was right when he said, I don't write it down to remember it later. I write it down to remember it now. I have found that, For instance, you've probably seen me before, JJ, at church. When I'm sitting there listening to a sermon, I'm madly taking notes. I'm looking up cross references, and I'm putting it all down. I may never go back and look at those notes again, but by writing it down, I'm learning the material as I'm listening to it. And as a result, I don't need to go back to it over and over again. I've got it. And if I need to go back to it, I can go to my notes and try and hunt down where I wrote it down. I'm doing a podcast with a Bible reading ministry on Thursday, and I'm covering the section of Hebrews that Moses is in. And one of the things that kind of struck me was how often Moses is quoted in the New Testament. So I just did a quick, just sort of concordance search and just discovered that Isaiah is only quoted 55 times in the New Testament, and the Psalms are only quoted 42 times in the New Testament, but Moses is quoted 162 times in the New Testament. That's a peculiar little line of research, but what that did for me was it caused me to realize, okay, so the book of Hebrews really is a commentary on the Mosaic Law. And this is a really, really important aspect of our understanding of the gospel. So it was really just a peculiar little rabbit trail, but it became for me this huge structural understanding that will help inform my time on the podcast.
I love that emphasis on curiosity and following rabbit trails, pulling the yarn, as it were. It also, your note-taking system and not necessarily referencing back, but remembering in the moment, is a point in favor of not using a digital note-taking system, just a purely practical note there, because the digital note systems are optimized for researching and referencing back. But I find I never remember anything I put into them. So just a point in that direction.
Yeah, scientists in pedagogy and learning have noted that handwriting your notes is about 75% more efficient for memory than any other form. Audio recording, recording digitally, typing, doesn't matter. Handwriting is so efficient for the memory.
That makes me really glad to hear that, because I insist on my students handwriting their notes. So I'll be glad to be able to pull that stat out for their benefit. I'm curious. Well, okay, so I'll cop to maybe a silly question, or maybe just a question that's gonna seem maybe a little foolish, but I from time to time will just get overwhelmed and even downright depressed about the sheer number of books that exist in the world, and just the sheer amount of knowledge that is in the world. I walk into Barnes and Noble, and the first 20 minutes are great, and then I realize that I can't read every book that's on the shelf, and I just kind of end up wandering in a daze in the nonfiction section. And I'm wondering. You seem to have just jumped right past that existential angst and taken the intellectual bull by the horns. How do you not get overwhelmed by the sheer amount of the sheer weight of knowledge that exists in the world?
Well, some of the vastness of even my own personal library will sometimes overwhelm me. And so I just have to realize, okay, I can only do what I can do. So I'm going to do it as efficiently and as intentionally as I can. There's a wonderful story. Samuel Johnson, on his deathbed, with his almost his final words, said to the doctor who was attending him, "Oh, but I still have so much to read." There will never be a complete satisfaction with how far, how deep we're able to go. So what we've got to do is simply create a plan, follow that plan as best we can, make the plan as flexible as possible so that you can, make some divergent pathways from time to time. I sort of got off on this Teddy Roosevelt Jr., Archie Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt sort of jag accidentally because I came across a book that I'd never heard of called His Father's Son. And so it was the biography of Ted Jr. And I just grabbed it. It wasn't a part of my plan for the summer. I grabbed it and I thought, oh, this is fascinating. And from there, I've now kind of, gone off in a whole, host of different directions. Ted Jr.'s wife has written a book. Archie wrote 3 books. I've gathered them all. I bought them all, and I'm in the process of reading them all. And none of that was a part of the plan. So I had a plan for the summer. I'm trying to stick to that plan, but I also want to be flexible enough to follow these peculiar little threads. And that's what gives, the process of learning real joy and delight.
On a similar note, you've got so many threads and tendrils reaching into so many far reaches of the intellectual space. Is there a book or an author that you find yourself returning back to again and again, like one book that you've read in your library more than the others?
Well, the G.K. Chesterton I can go to anytime, anywhere. I read his book Orthodoxy every January and have for about 40 years. And I've read at the same time in January, I also read Abraham Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, the Stone Lectures. And I read that every January. So those are 2 real go-tos. I've probably read the Narnia books 10, 12 times. I've read Pilgrim's Progress at least 10 times. I love Umberto Eco, and I go to Umberto Eco a lot, both his fiction and his nonfiction. John Buchan is one of my all-time favorites. I read as much of John Buchan as I can, and I've read at least 3 or 4 biographies of him. I've read almost every biography that has been written of Teddy Roosevelt and almost every major biography of Winston Churchill. Those are, passions of mine. I love Paul Johnson, the historian, and so I've read all of his books, about 45 of his books. And so I have a lot of favorites that I go to. I've got whole sections in my library where I've collected all of Belloc, all of Chesterton, all of Buchan, all of Sir Walter Scott, all of Umberto Eco, all of Teddy Roosevelt's books. Yeah, so and lots and lots of favorites.
May I say, his Tolkien collection is quite good as well. That's my favorite section of the library. So
I bet it's incredible.
Yeah, I'm working on a little project right now. Tolkien said he had a secret vice, and he gave a famous lecture at Oxford about his secret vice, which was the invention of languages. And the last time I was in England, I stumbled across Tolkien's very first book. Only 1,000 copies of it were ever printed, and it was a little paperback, so it's cheap. And very few of them have survived. But I now have 2 copies of it. It's his Anglo-Saxon dictionary. And so I'm working on a project now. I'm writing some stuff on Tolkien and his penchant for the creation of languages. The Mythopoeic Society has a whole website devoted to Tolkien languages. It's really amazing stuff.
Oh, wow.
We could just take an incredible sharp turn right now. Totally change the subject of this entire show.
I have a Chesterton question before we get to a Tolkien thread, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
We'll pump the brakes a little bit there. We have to learn about learning. When you're reading these books, do you tend to go through just as quickly and as many as possible, or do you have a more systematic approach for some?
Well, different kinds of books require different speeds. I'm reading, just started today, a new book on the publishing industry in the Dutch Republic in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's this huge volume with a ton of material. And I'm reading it fast. I'm just skimming. I'm not reading it for the beauty of the prose. I'm reading it for information. So when you're reading for information, you can go really fast. But you never want to go fast with Tolkien or Chesterton. In fact, I find Tolkien and Chesterton are best read out loud with emphasis and even voices, like you would read the Narnia tales to your kids. It's so different kinds of work really require a different kind of reading.
So riddle me this. Are you the kind of guy that you mark your books up or not?
Books for information, nonfiction books for information, I do highlight. I don't write in the margins, but I do use a highlighter, but I use a kind of highlighter that eventually fades and disappears. So I found these highlighters in Europe. You can get them now in the US. You can get anything from Amazon these days. And so I do highlight. I'm really careful. I'm very particular, but I never highlight in an antiquarian book.
Absolutely.
I don't want to harm the pages. And so
don't want to harm the history of that. Excellent.
Exactly.
As you go through, do you have a notebook open to the side, especially for informational and learning purposes?
And for quotes, yes, okay. I do.
Yes.
And anybody who knows anything about my work knows that I'm constantly quoting others. And I don't necessarily have a system for how I collect those quotes. I just make sure that when I run across this amazing quote, I write it down.
That's excellent. Kind of a shift, or this is similar topic, but just what are common ways that you see people attempting to learn things that you would say are errors and should be avoided when attempting to learn?
Well, first of all, everybody has a different learning style. So some people are more auditory learners. Some people are more visual learners. Some people are tactile learners. And so one of the things that's really important is to identify what your learning style is, where your strengths are. But that does not mean that you don't learn with all of the other methods and all of the other styles. It just means that the other styles are more work and you have to be a lot more intentional. But that said, again, brain science tells us that the least productive way to learn is by listening to things. So a lecture, for instance, or a sermon, that's the least efficient way to learn. It's part of the reason that during sermons, I am very diligent to take notes because I want to learn. I want to know what's there. And I want to understand where the preacher is taking me. And I'm not going to get there if I just listen. Same goes with audiobooks. Audiobooks are they're wonderful if you're out for a long drive, if you're on family vacation, if you're going to be in the car for 4 hours or longer. It's a great way to keep the family occupied and keep the mind occupied. But it's a terrible way to appreciate literature. And so I am not someone who says you shouldn't listen to audiobooks. It's just that should not be the only way that you take in books, because it's the least efficient way to learn. The other thing is, it's always better when you're learning with others. There is something about making connections with others that really, really helps the learning process. This is why small group discussions, the Socratic method in the classroom are so effective, because it engages multiple aspects of the brain, multiple aspects of the learning process.
Along the lines of questions about styles of learning, I noticed you've done a lot of thinking, a lot of research on the differences between Christianity and Islam and the Muslim traditions. I'm curious. We think a lot about Christian education in our circles. I know that there's a lot of a lot of emphasis in the Islamic tradition as well on education. Are there any prominent differences that come to mind with thinking between those two styles, and anything we can kind of learn from the antithesis there?
Well, yes. In the Islamic world, the primary approach to learning is imitative. It involves largely memorization. And while memorization is really important, you have to master certain fundamentals in order to really go on. But one of the things that the Christian tradition does, rather than imitating, merely memorizing, the Christian tradition moves from that grammar stage to a level of understanding, and then attempts to move the student from understanding to wisdom. This is laid out in the book of Proverbs. It's really evident in the Shema of Deuteronomy, and it becomes really evident in the way the Apostle Paul disciples his young disciples like Timothy and Titus. So it's not merely mastering material. It's beginning to use that material and apply it to the wider world. So this is one of the reasons why in the Islamic world, because memorization is key to mathematics, you have an incredible amount of good mathematics, and all the way up to almost the level of theoretical math, but it never goes beyond into theoretical math. Whereas in the West, you master the details through memorization, but then you start making connections and you allow curiosity to go from mere grammar to rhetoric, and then from rhetoric all the way to the level of the dialectic, to the level of wisdom. That's a vast difference. So when you look at Islamic architecture is always derivative. It's derivative from Greek architecture and Byzantine architecture, and it basically stops. It doesn't progress from the time of the Islamic conquests. It pretty much stays the same because it's imitative. Whereas when you look at the West at the same time, there are all of these developments. You go from the Romanesque to the Gothic, from the Gothic to the Baroque, from the Baroque to the Palladian, and you just see this, this constant development. And that's because the Western Christian tradition really is designed to move beyond mere mimesis all the way to the place of wisdom. The Hebrew word for wisdom literally means skillful fingers. It's a word that means putting all of that knowledge and all of that understanding to work in the real world. And that requires creativity, imagination. It requires delighting in making the connections. And that's a huge, huge difference.
How do you foster that creativity and that passion, as you put it, both for yourself, but also for the next generation?
Well, one of the things that Charlotte Mason did was she laid out for teachers a vision for how to stir up delight in observing the world, teaching children how to see. And that's as simple as going on a walk in the woods and noticing the different leaves and the trees and pointing them out, and finding the snail under the rock and all of that kind of stuff. It's an exposure that causes delight, and using that as the primary beginning place for learning. It's the place of curiosity and inquiry. Once you have inculcated a sense of curiosity and inquiry, there is some drudgery. You have to memorize your ABCs. You have to finally be able to sound out words and figure out spelling sequences and all of that. But then once the basics are in place, then you can launch and follow the pathway of delight. And that's where curiosity takes you.
One thing I've experienced among my peers, well, I say my peers, I happen to be surrounded by a wonderful community, but around young men my own age who I interact with on occasion, is this sense of cynicism towards curiosity, and that a sense of we don't need that childlike wonder. How do you combat that both within yourself, but then help bring others along on that journey?
Well, I think you're right to say that it's got to start with you. And you've got to combat it in your own heart and mind and life. And when you're exhausted after a long day of work, or you've had a lot of tedium, a lot of people think, okay, the best thing I can do is just sit here and binge watch something on Netflix. And of course, that's the worst thing. That is the worst thing you can do. It's dulling. It's like a drug. And so the first thing that I would say is in our own lives, we've got to set in place certain disciplines. The discipline to say, okay, I'm not going to ban television or social media, but I'm going to limit it. I'm going to put boundaries on it. And I'm going to create a plan that I'm going to work through in the same way that I have to have a plan to know where I'm going to go as I study the scriptures. I need to have a plan on how to develop the mind. And I need a balanced diet. So I'm going to read a little bit of fiction. I'm going to read a little bit of history. I'm going to read a little bit of something that's just completely outside of my world. I remember when I was in my 20s, I had grown up my whole life thinking I was terrible at math. And I am terrible at math. But I decided, that there is something marvelous in the way that God has orchestrated the world in an orderly way. I need to not despise this. I need to explore it. And so I just went out and found an old antiquarian copy of Euclid. And I found a copy of Richard Hofstadter's Metamagical Themas, and I just started reading theoretical math, and I fell in love with it. And what I discovered was that by exploring math, and particularly theoretical math, it helped me with my music. And all of a sudden, I was able to follow things both in listening to music and in playing music that I never could before. And it was math that was the pathway to that.
I love
That's so fascinating.
The inner twisting threads of the various ways of learning. There's just this constant theme throughout this entire conversation of just pull on that thread and it'll take you somewhere new. And that's very exciting.
Hofstadter wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And, he ties together how Johann Sebastian Bach and that wildly imaginative, puzzle-making artist Escher, how they actually were following the same kind of patterns. And all of that can be found in Gödel's mathematical theorems. And he ties it all together, and it causes you to go, oh, my word, what an incredible world. It's what C.S. Lewis was really wrestling with in the Narnia series as he was attempting to develop a theme around the planetary spheres, one of the spheres for each of the novels. And that's the whole theme of the famous book Planet Narnia, where you start to realize, oh my goodness, there's a lot more going on here than talking animals.
As we're talking about, kind of these elements of Christian education, of education in general, of developing these themes of curiosity and wonder and this sort of thing. I'm curious if you'd be willing to speak to the state of Christian education today. How would you say we're doing in this as on the whole? Is this something? Are Christians right now? Are we holding up our end of the bargain? Are we being faithful in our Christian education, or do we still have maybe a lot of work to do in this area?
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do in this area, and we always will have a lot of work to do in this area. I don't think we ever arrive. I am encouraged by what I see in the homeschool world and in the classical Christian school world, but that's still a tiny sliver of the American church and of the American evangelical church. I think that right now the American evangelical church is in a kind of free fall, and it's pretty disastrous. So while I'm very encouraged by the tiny sliver, and fortunately I live in that tiny sliver, and I'm encouraged by what I see there, but overall, I think the best way to describe what we're seeing right now in the American church is what Francis Schaeffer described as the great evangelical disaster.
Could you say more about that? What is so disastrous about where we are? What was Schaeffer talking about there?
Well, Schaeffer was talking primarily about compromise with the world and the willingness of evangelicals. The fact that we have evangelicals who have compromised on every single major moral issue, the fact that biblical literacy is at an all-time low. I think what Schaeffer was saying was, he called the compromise latitudinarianism, and the concept of latitudinarianism, compromise across the whole board. It's not just liberalism, it's the collapse of any kind of distinctive Christian saltiness. It's pervasive in the American church. And every year, Ligonier Ministries does a kind of a state of the church survey where they examine, what do people believe about the virgin birth, the resurrection? What do they believe about the deity of Christ? What do they believe about issues like purity in marriage, human sexuality, the questions of LGBTQ plus, abortion, all of those kinds of things. And what we find is that in most cases, less than half of those who claim to be evangelicals have anything remotely like a Christian view of these issues.
And I'm guessing education is a key element of this. If people aren't learning some important things at an early stage, then and they're being introduced to thought in different places without kind of a Christian backbone, that's going to have a huge effect, right?
It does. It has a huge effect. The other thing is that we've turned churches into entertainment centers rather than a place of piety, holiness, growth, maturity, and depth. And so, when church is basically just, a rock concert with some pleasant tips on how to have a happy life, you're not getting much Christianity.
Yeah, that's a sobering point. Well, I know we need to start heading towards wrapping up. I have like two questions that are more in the left field category. JJ, I don't know if you want to throw any more heavy questions, more serious questions in first.
I will save my final question for the final question.
Sounds good. Dr. Grant, did I see you were wearing a Houston Astros logo shirt here?
You did observe that, yes.
Are you a baseball fan?
I am a baseball fan. I grew up in Houston. I was actually in the stadium of the Houston Colt 45s when Judge Roy Hoffines, the owner of the club, announced that 1,000 yards from home field, he was going to build a new space-age stadium, the Astrodome. So I've been an Astros fan since before they were the Astros.
Wow. Hey, how do you? I have to ask. I'm a huge sports fan myself, and I'm sure one of the most popular teams to rag on these days is the Astros. How do you, as an Astros fan, what do you tend to rebut the haters, or do you do you have a pat line? How do you handle it?
Well, it's kind of like when everybody was down on the New England Patriots, right, because they were stealing signals and deflating balls and everything. Same thing with Lance Armstrong and the use of EPO. Truth is, all of those guys in every sport take every advantage they possibly can.
Right.
The guys who get caught are the ones that we zero in on. But the truth is they all are seeking, whatever advantage they can. So is it something to lament that they, skirt the rules and cheat? Yes. But you realize they're all doing it.
They're all doing it. Yeah. Well, I'm a Pittsburgh Pirates fan myself. And so I know for myself, I wish that our team, I sometimes I wish they were stealing more signals because, then we would win some games, which would be nice.
Yeah.
My last question is, I'm sure you've read, all of the G.K. Chesterton that's out there. There's one G.K. Chesterton book that has both amazed, haunted, and just mystified me for all time, which is The Man Who Was Thursday. Have you read that one?
Oh, of course. I've read it multiple times.
So I have to ask, what is that book about? What is that ending about? I've loved it. I think it's an amazing book. I've never understood the ending of that book.
Well, the book is about the foolishness of conspiracies. And it's also about corruption in high places. So the manufacturing of conspiracies for political or personal gain. So that's what the book is about. It was written in the midst of the so-called Marconi scandal, which was sort of a government scam to corner the market on modern-day communications, Marconi radio transmitter. And so it's a book really about how all of the so-called good guys are actually the bad guys, and all of the bad guys portray themselves as good guys, and the whole thing is a masquerade. So in a sense, he's skewering the elites and showing that everything is fake.
Very good. Well, if folks haven't read that one, check that one out. It's a great read. Thanks for the analysis.
Yeah, it's a blast. I love that book.
Great book. I remember reading that in high school. I think you gave it to me to read, Dr. Grant. And
I think I did.
I think I did. Equally as mystified as Banjo was. So thank you. My final question is always the same, because we're young men seeking to help other young men. If you could talk to one young man tomorrow who may not have had the greatest education, but he's deciding, I'm ready to start this life of learning thing, what is the one thing you would tell him to start doing tomorrow?
Start first thing in the morning in the Word of God, systematically work through one chapter and notice everything that is there, and then go back to that same chapter the next day.
Well, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. George Grant.
It's been my joy.
This has been the Forging Honor podcast. Music and production is by Elliot George. For more information about what we do or to learn how to get involved, visit our website at forginghonor.com. There you'll find information about our community, the Forge, and how to join other young men seeking to glorify God in thought, word, and deed. You'll also find blog articles, book recommendations, and more ways to grow as a Christian man.
If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend or family member about Forging Honor. We would also appreciate it if you would take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, a rating and review only takes a moment, and it goes a long way towards growing the Forging Honor community.
Thanks for taking the time with us today. We hope you'll take up the work alongside us and join us in the task of Forging Honor. We'll see you next time.